Most people think they seek stimulation because stimulation feels pleasurable. Music, scrolling, conversation, podcasts, notifications, entertainment, noise, movement, and constant information all appear to provide enjoyment, distraction, or engagement. But psychologically, continuous stimulation often serves a deeper function beneath awareness. It helps regulate the nervous system against silence. When external stimulation disappears, many people experience discomfort almost immediately. Thoughts become louder, emotional tension becomes more noticeable, unresolved memories surface, anxiety increases, attention turns inward. The mind suddenly loses the external structures helping organize consciousness continuously throughout the day. This is why silence often feels psychologically heavier than people expect. The discomfort is not simply boredom, it is exposure. Without constant input, the nervous system can no longer avoid direct contact with the internal instability, uncertainty, emotional tension, and unresolved psychological activity normally covered by continuous stimulation. The result is that the mind begins seeking noise automatically, not always because noise feels good, but because silence removes protective distraction systems the nervous system has learned to depend on for emotional regulation beneath awareness. What feels like harmless stimulation can therefore function partly as psychological avoidance operating continuously throughout everyday life. The brain prefers constant input because attention stabilizes experience predictively. External stimulation gives the nervous system structured information to organize around. Sounds, screens, conversations, routines, and endless content continuously occupy awareness, reducing the amount of unstructured internal space consciousness must confront directly. This creates temporary psychological stability because external focus narrows awareness away from unresolved emotional material underneath. Silence removes those organizing structures. Once external input fades, attention naturally turns inward again. The nervous system then encounters whatever emotional tension, uncertainty, anxiety, loneliness, identity instability, or unresolved thought patterns were previously masked by stimulation. This is why many people instinctively reach for their phone during moments of stillness without fully realizing why. The action often happens automatically because the nervous system learned that external stimulation quickly regulates internal discomfort. The mind experiences the urge as ordinary habit, while remaining mostly unaware of the deeper emotional regulation process driving it beneath awareness. Overthinking intensifies in silence because the predictive mind dislikes unstructured uncertainty. When external stimulation decreases, the nervous system often redirects energy toward internal simulation instead. Thoughts multiply. Conversations replay. Future scenarios appear. Emotional analysis increases. The brain begins generating mental activity automatically in order to maintain prediction and structure internally once external structure weakens. This is why many people feel mentally restless during quiet moments even when physically safe. The nervous system interprets stillness as unresolved openness requiring psychological organization. Overthinking, therefore, becomes another form of stimulation. The mind fills silence with analysis, because continuous mental movement feels emotionally safer than direct exposure to uncertainty, emptiness, or unresolved emotional experience underneath. What appears externally as thinking too much is often the nervous system attempting to stabilize itself against unstructured internal space beneath awareness. Phone addiction reveals this process clearly because modern stimulation systems continuously interrupt silence before awareness fully encounters it. Notifications, scrolling, short-form content, endless information streams, music, messaging, and algorithmic novelty provide constant attentional occupation. The nervous system receives repeated bursts of external engagement that prevent sustained inward attention from stabilizing for very long. Over time, the brain becomes increasingly adapted to continuous stimulation cycles because those cycles regulate discomfort predictively. Moments without input begin feeling emotionally incomplete or strangely exposed. The person then reaches for stimulation automatically, not necessarily because the content itself matters deeply, but because the interruption of silence temporarily restores psychological regulation. The compulsive quality emerges because the nervous system increasingly associates external stimulation with emotional stabilization beneath awareness. Loneliness becomes difficult to tolerate partly for the same reason. Being alone removes many external structures that normally stabilize identity, attention, emotional regulation, and narrative continuity socially. Without ongoing interaction, the mind often becomes more aware of unresolved emotional states, uncertainty, identity instability, and internal tension that social stimulation previously softened. This is why solitude can feel emotionally overwhelming even when no immediate external threat exists. The nervous system evolved relationally. Social environments continuously regulate attention, emotion, and identity predictively. When those environments disappear temporarily, internal psychological activity becomes more visible. The resulting discomfort then motivates renewed stimulation-seeking behavior automatically, because external engagement restores emotional orientation and structure again. Silence therefore feels emotionally heavy not only because nothing is happening externally, but because internal experience becomes harder to avoid once external occupation disappears. The mind also fears silence, because silence weakens identity reinforcement temporarily. Throughout daily life, identity is continuously stabilized through activity, conversation, goals, routines, reactions, roles, and external engagement. People constantly receive reminders of who they are through interaction with environments and other individuals. Work reinforces competence. Social interaction reinforces personality. Achievement reinforces value. Habits reinforce continuity. But silence interrupts these reinforcement systems. When external structure disappears, the familiar signals maintaining identity coherence weaken temporarily. The nervous system then loses some of the ongoing confirmation it normally uses to stabilize the self predictively. This can create a subtle sense of psychological emptiness or disorientation beneath awareness. The person may suddenly feel emotionally untethered without understanding why. Continuous stimulation therefore functions partly as identity maintenance. Activity keeps the self feeling solid. Silence exposes how dependent identity often is on constant reinforcement from external structure and mental movement beneath awareness. Emotional avoidance becomes deeply connected to stimulation because unresolved feelings become more visible when distraction decreases. Grief, shame, regret, loneliness, fear, uncertainty, emotional exhaustion, and unresolved memories often remain partially suppressed during periods of constant engagement because attention stays externally occupied. But silence removes competing input. Emotional material previously pushed beneath awareness begins surfacing more clearly. The nervous system then experiences stillness as emotionally threatening because silence increases contact with unresolved internal states. This is why many people instinctively avoid quiet environments after painful experiences. Music plays constantly, television remains on in the background, endless scrolling continues late into the night, conversations become compulsive. The stimulation itself may appear harmless, but psychologically it often functions as emotional buffering, protecting the mind from direct confrontation with unresolved internal experience beneath awareness. Modern overstimulation intensifies this process because contemporary environments provide almost uninterrupted access to distraction. Human nervous systems evolved in conditions containing long periods of stillness, limited stimulation, and slower informational rhythms. Modern technology radically altered those conditions by creating endless streams of novelty, social reinforcement, predictive engagement, and attentional interruption available continuously. The brain adapts quickly to repeated stimulation because novelty activates reward and attention systems automatically. Over time, silence begins feeling increasingly unfamiliar compared to constant engagement. The nervous system then experiences ordinary stillness as emotionally uncomfortable, simply because the absence of stimulation now contrasts sharply against the intensity of everyday input. This does not mean technology itself is inherently harmful. It means nervous systems designed for periodic stillness are now continuously trained toward external occupation, making psychological quiet feel increasingly difficult to tolerate beneath awareness. The fear of silence is also connected to uncertainty because quiet removes many predictive structures the brain depends on emotionally. External stimulation continuously narrows attention into manageable patterns. Silence reopens awareness more broadly. The mind then encounters unresolved possibilities, emotional ambiguity, existential questions, and internal instability without immediate distraction available to organize them away. This creates nervous system tension because uncertainty becomes more psychologically visible. The brain often responds by generating internal stimulation automatically through overthinking, fantasy, worry, mental replay, or compulsive planning. Even internal noise can feel safer than stillness because continuous mental activity preserves structure and prediction. The resulting restlessness then feels personal and unavoidable when, psychologically, the nervous system may simply be struggling to tolerate unstructured awareness without immediately filling it with compensatory activity again. This is why boredom often feels strangely uncomfortable rather than neutral. Boredom is not merely the absence of entertainment. It is the nervous system losing externally organized engagement while not yet tolerating unstructured internal awareness comfortably. The mind suddenly becomes aware of time, emotional restlessness, internal tension, unmet desires, unresolved thoughts, and attentional instability all at once. The resulting discomfort motivates immediate stimulation-seeking behavior because engagement restores structure quickly. The person then interprets the relief from stimulation as pleasure, without realizing how much of the reward came from escaping the discomfort of unoccupied awareness beneath it. Continuous engagement therefore becomes reinforcing, not only because stimulation feels good, but because silence increasingly feels emotionally difficult to tolerate. Many people believe they are relaxing while remaining continuously stimulated, but the nervous system often stays actively occupied even during supposed rest. Watching content endlessly, scrolling passively, consuming constant information, or multitasking through multiple stimulation streams may feel restful compared to work or stress, yet awareness rarely becomes truly still. Attention remains externally engaged, prediction remains active, emotional regulation continues through stimulation. The mind therefore receives very little direct experience of unstructured silence. Over time, the absence of stillness itself becomes psychologically unfamiliar. The nervous system begins depending on continuous occupation to maintain emotional regulation, because true psychological quiet rarely occurs long enough for deeper adaptation to develop beneath awareness. The discomfort of silence becomes strongest when identity itself feels unstable underneath stimulation. If the self is heavily dependent on achievement, distraction, productivity, validation, or external engagement for emotional coherence, silence may expose how fragile those structures actually are beneath constant reinforcement. Without activity, unresolved uncertainty about meaning, identity, value, or emotional direction becomes more visible. The nervous system then experiences stillness as psychologically exposing, because silence interrupts the external system's previously stabilizing self-perception continuously. This is why some people feel overwhelming restlessness when nothing demands their attention. The silence is not empty psychologically. It reveals internal instability that constant stimulation had previously helped organize away from awareness. The mind therefore learns to fear silence, not because silence itself is dangerous, but because silence reduces distraction enough for underlying psychological instability to become visible again. Once this association forms, The nervous system begins avoiding stillness automatically. External occupation becomes emotionally protective. Constant stimulation keeps awareness moving fast enough to prevent sustained confrontation with unresolved emotional material, uncertainty, loneliness, identity instability, or existential discomfort underneath. The resulting behavioral loops feel ordinary because modern environments normalize continuous engagement socially. Yet beneath much of that stimulation may exist a deeper avoidance structure, the nervous system protecting itself from prolonged contact with unstructured internal experience it has not fully learned how to tolerate calmly. This is why sustained silence can initially feel emotionally overwhelming when people first encounter it intentionally. Without immediate stimulation, the mind often becomes louder before it becomes quieter. Thoughts intensify, emotional tension surfaces, restlessness increases. Internal discomfort becomes more visible because the nervous system no longer has constant external occupation, suppressing awareness of it. Many people interpret this reaction as proof they cannot tolerate silence. But psychologically, the discomfort may simply reflect unresolved internal activity finally becoming noticeable once distraction weakens. The nervous system had been continuously managing instability through stimulation. Silence interrupts the management system temporarily, exposing what remained active underneath all along. The deeper realization is not that stimulation is inherently wrong, or that silence is morally superior. It is that the mind often depends on continuous occupation to maintain emotional stability, identity coherence, and protection from unresolved internal experience beneath awareness. Constant stimulation keeps attention moving, prediction active, identity reinforced, and emotional exposure limited. Silence interrupts those systems. The nervous system then loses many of the structures normally organizing psychological experience automatically. Once this becomes visible, a different understanding of stillness emerges. Silence stops appearing as empty absence and begins appearing as direct contact with the mind underneath its continuous self-distraction. And within that realization, the fear of quiet starts making psychological sense. The mind was never simply avoiding boredom. Much of the time, it was avoiding prolonged contact with the instability, uncertainty, emotional tension, and unresolved experience hidden beneath the endless movement of thought, stimulation, and distraction all along.